This is chapter 17, blood. So blood is considered a tissue. It's a connective tissue. It's a fluid connective tissue. And all connective tissues consist of proteins and uh, ground substance in their matrix. In this case, the ground substance is liquid. It's plasma. And it has proteins floating in it. So it's really the same sort of thing. There are always cells in connective tissue, and the cells are, in the case of blood, are called formed elements. And the reason they're called formed elements is because really platelets and erythrocytes don't have a nucleus, so they aren't full, complete cells. So it's just easier to call them formed elements, probably more accurate. So blood is really, it's variable. It's variable over time in an individual. It's variable between individuals. So we measure all kinds of things about the blood. As you know, going for blood work is an important diagnostic tool. So one of the fundamental things that we measure in blood is how much of that blood is made up of red blood cells. And we call that measurement hematocrit. It's really, I prefer just to say it's 45%, give or take, 45 to 50%. It's a little bit lower in women than it is in men. It's lower in women in childbearing years. It starts to match when women are postmenopausal or prepubescent. So it's someplace about half. We can take blood, you take whole blood and you put it in a test tube and you spin it. What happens is that the cells, which are in suspension rather than in solution or even colloid, will actually settle out due to the centrifugal force of centrifuging them. And what happens is all the heaviest elements, the red blood cells, go to the bottom of the tube. Just above it are the lighter formed elements, the white blood cells and the platelets. And we call that the buffy coat. And then what's above that is kind of this straw-colored liquid called plasma. And it's usually about 55% plasma, 45% red blood cells, erythrocytes, with less than 1% being this little layer of leukocytes and platelets called the buffy coat. When we look at blood, it tends to be sticky, it tends to be fairly viscous, it's opaque. If there's lots of oxygen in it, it can be fairly bright red scarlet. If it's low in oxygen, it becomes darker red. The pH is kept in a very, very close place, 7.35 to 7.45. We're going to see later in the course when we talk about acid-base balance how it's maintained in such a tight pH range, but it's 7.35 to 7.45. Blood's also slightly warmer than body tissue at 38 degrees. It's interesting that it says here the average volume of blood is 5 to 6 liters for males, 4 to 5 liters for females. It's got less to do with gender and has more to do with physical size. A 200-pound, 6-foot woman would have closer to 6 liters of blood, and not 4 liters of blood. A 5'8", 150-pound man will have about 5 liters of blood. It's the 5'2", 100-pound woman that has 4 liters of blood. It's got more to do with their physical size, and the average physical size for men is bigger than the average physical size for women, and that's what's reflected here, not gender differences. So what do we use blood for? The obvious thing is, and this is a list of 3, by the way, the obvious thing is we move stuff around the body with it. We move oxygen and nutrients around the body and distribute them to the tissues. We pick up metabolic waste and we move them to wherever we're going to get rid of it, usually kidneys and lungs. Sometimes it's skin. We use it as a transport for hormones from the endocrine organs. That blood is an important distributor of hormones. Another function is regulation, and really it's regulation of body temperature and maintaining normal pH in tissues because it buffers that, and it regulates fluid volume in general, but particularly in the circulatory system. So it's kind of self-regulating at that. It distributes body temperature. What do you do if your hands are cold? You rub them to bring more blood to that area. There's a protective function of blood. It protects against blood loss. It carries its own protection. In the next video or two, we'll talk about hemostasis, which is blood clotting. Blood also, in terms of white blood cells, are very important in the immune system. It protects us against infections. There's antibodies floating in the blood. There's complement, neutrophils, monocytes. All of that are all really considered elements of the blood. And so protection is a hugely important function. So we're going to break it out and look at each of the different things. So the plasma, the part that's at the top of the centrifuge tube, the straw-colored, mostly liquid, is mostly liquid. It's 90% water. And there's a bunch of proteins that are in that water. The proteins, really, there's 3 really important ones, and then there's a bunch of other fairly minor ones. But this is, again, a list of 3 important proteins that are found in blood plasma. The number one most important, and the one that is the most prevalent at 60%, is albumin. And albumin's main job is to regulate the osmosis. It's about being able to draw fluid back into the capillaries through osmosis, and it's really about regulating fluid balances between compartments, between the interstitial fluid and the blood, and therefore between inside the cell, intracellular, and the interstitial fluid, because you kind of indirectly regulate it using albumin. That's the number one job of that. At 36% are proteins called globulins, and sometimes they're called gamma globulins, sometimes they're called immunoglobulins. These are really antibodies. These are when we talked about immunity last semester, and we were talking about humoral immunity and antibody production by plasma cells. They're proteins, and they float freely in the blood, and they're globular proteins, so they're globulins. The third most abundant, really only at 4%, is something called fibrinogen. And anytime you see a protein with the name gen at the end, like the suffix gen, then it's it means that it will generate. It is an inactive form of the enzyme or the protein that's involved. And when we talk hemostasis, we're going to be talking about how when blood clots, fibrinogen becomes activated into fibrin and is integral in the process of clotting. We can't afford to make fibrin when we're bleeding because there's no time. We have to stop the bleeding. So instead what we do is we make an inactive form that isn't involved in clotting, and so we call it fibrinogen, and we activate it when we need it. Also in the plasma are various things that are dissolved in the plasma. So byproducts of metabolism are there. This is where the lactic acid ends up. This is where creatinine, which is a waste product of muscle metabolism. This is where urea happens. That's going to eventually be removed by the urinary system. And that's a product of protein metabolism. Is when you oxidize proteins to make ATP, you have a nitrogen left over, and it's waste product, and you have to get rid of it. And we get rid of it as urea. This is where the nutrients are, blood glucose levels. This is circulating other carbohydrates other than glucose. This is where the amino acids get circulated and brought to the tissues that are going to use them to make proteins. We're going to spend a lot of time, and we have already spent a lot of time, talking about the electrolytes: sodium, potassium, calcium, chlorine, bicarbonate. Those things are all hugely important to physiology, and they move around the body. They find their balance dissolved in blood plasma. There are respiratory gases in here, mostly CO2 in the form of bicarbonate, or directly dissolved in the plasma. A little bit of the oxygen is dissolved in the plasma, about 1.5%. Hormones are all in here, so all of the steroid sex hormones, all of the hormones like cortisol and things like that are all transported, dissolved in the blood plasma. The formed elements, which is the bottom part of the centrifuge blood, is really made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And these are called formed elements. And like I said before, they're formed elements because they don't have a nucleus. The only one that does are white blood cells. They're the complete cells. The red blood cells really don't have any mitochondria. They don't have any nucleus, nothing like that. They really are just bags of hemoglobin. Platelets themselves, which are sometimes called thrombocytes, are just little fragments of cell. Usually these are short-lived because they don't have any facility to repair themselves, usually measured in days, although some of them can be pretty long-lasting. And all these formed elements are made in the bone marrow. So there are stem cells in the bone marrow that give rise to all of these, as we'll see in the next video. So when you look at a smear of blood, this is what you're seeing. You're seeing a lot of white space here, which is where the plasma is. An awful lot of these erythrocytes, which are they look like little donuts here in this picture. Relatively fewer white blood cells, and you can see that we have a couple of neutrophils, a lymphocyte, and a monocyte. A monocyte will eventually become a macrophage, and a few platelets in this particular picture.